I'm sitting in my mom's car in 2006. I'm 9 years old, and I'm listening to Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix for the first time. I'm alone in the car, surrounded by silence until the first creaks of that guitar riff kick into place. It's immediately intoxicating to me, and there's no escape now. I'm sitting in the car being pulled farther and farther, with each pluck of a string before Jimi Hendrix launches into the meat of the song. He's using the guitar in a way that I've never heard before or since. In this song, I'm not just hearing a rock song. It feels like I'm experiencing an artistic piece. The colors of Jimi Hendrix's guitar are now dancing around my car and in my little mind. For a moment, I am elsewhere. I'm not parked in my mom's hot car on a weeknight. I'm within the space that the song has created, and I'm completely hooked. I don't even realize how influential this moment will be to the rest of my life. I will crave moments like this again and again, searching for more and more music that fills this insatiable urge in my gut. I think back to this memory of myself listening to Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix for the first time in my mom's car on the middle of a weeknight. And I think about the fact that this recording had already existed for 38 years. Something that I was experiencing for the first time was so old to so many others. And yet, this is a song that has never grown old to me. It forever feels fresh, forever ignites something new within me with each listen. And I get that same feeling that I had when I was 9 in 2006. I feel new. The 1960s has always been seen as a decade of youth. Perhaps it's the reason why this decade continues to inspire so many youthful people long after it's ended. But as photographer David Bailey put it, the 60s never really ended. The decade continues to spring eternal with every new generation that gravitates towards it. To me, the 1960s definitely represents youth. With its collective eagerness to learn, to reach new heights in art, science, and politics, in its optimism and its fascination with and determination towards progress. But I think more deeply, what the 1960s represents for humanity as a whole more than anything else is growth. And I think there's no better way to analyze this growth than with the musical evolution of the 1960s. The progression of popular music in the 1960s is a thrill to track and research. Every year there was some new technique being discovered. Musical artists were basically falling over each other trying to outdo their contemporaries. Each new song and each new album was the continuation of a soundtrack to a generation, to an era of intense social awareness and change. In fact, the changes and advancements in music in the 1960s were so stark that you can actually hear it change year by year. While I'd love to sit here and analyze every song of the 1960s, I feel like that would become a little tedious for both my audience and my editor. So instead, we're going to break this down one song by year from 1960 to 1969. And we're going to do this by analyzing the Billboard #1 song from each year from 1960 to 1969. And just for clarification, we're sticking to numbers and statistics from the US for this video. Starting with the year 1960, we're going to take a look at the first #1 song from the first year of this decade. The #1 song in the year 1960 was Theme from a Summer Place. Originally written by Mac Descant and Max Steiner for the 1959 film A Summer Place, it was Percy Faith's version that was released in September of 1959 that would go on to be the most popular version of this song. Faith's version was not an immediate success, but by January of 1960, it was all over the place. The song was at the top of the charts by January of 1960, where it would sit for an unprecedented 9 weeks at that spot. Theme from a Summer Place is usually considered the crown jewel of the easy listening genre, and it's certainly easy to hear why. The track is lush and it evokes feelings of a summer day in the early 1960s, sitting by your perfect pool in your perfect American suburbia, with your golden retriever running around in your yard. Your husband has just arrived home from work to find the fully made dinner that you've laid across the table. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. In 1960, the United States was still surging from the post-war boom of the 1950s, with not so much youthful optimism, but sort of like a blissful ignorance kind of deal going on. Eisenhower was still president. The Vietnam War had not yet really began. The beginning of this decade clung to what it knew from the 1950s, and many felt like they didn't want to leave the mindset of a decade that had been known for its American prosperity. There were, however, some things rustling behind the scenes. This was the same year of the Greensboro sit-ins, where 4 black college students sat at a segregated bar at a Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. Technically, they were able to sit at the counter, but they were not allowed to be served. So by sitting at the counter, they were demonstrating a nonviolent protest. And 6 months after their protest, they would actually be served at that counter. 1960 is also the same year that the FDA approved birth control. Eisenhower would sign the Civil Rights Act of 1960 as well, which was meant to help stop discrimination at the polls. That summer, a young man named Cassius Clay would win the gold medal in boxing at the 1960 Summer Olympics. Already the seeds for this decade were slowly being planted, even if a lot of people were resistant to the change. In 1961, we have the song called Tossin and Turning by Bobby Lewis. 1961, the first year of the Kennedys! This is also the year that the song Tossin and Turning by Bobby Lewis reigned at #1 for the year. The song is exciting and infectious in that perfect late 1950s, early 1960s way that just sort of calls you to the dance floor. Already you can start to feel a shift from the first year of the decade with this song. This is the year that Kennedy would establish the Peace Corps. This is the year that a chimp would be sent into space, as well as the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. This is also the year that the Vietnam War would officially begin in December of 1961. Despite all of this, the music of this year is pretty cheery and dance-worthy. Tossin and Turning would go on to sell over 1 million copies, earning a gold disc. 1962, Stranger on the Shore by Acker Bilk. Next up on this list, we have a sort of odd departure from our song of 1961. Stranger on the Shore by Acker Bilk is a clarinet piece, originally called Jenny for the songwriter's daughter. The song is definitely of the easy listening variety, much more similar to our original first song of 1960 than our song of 1961. But it's perhaps not as memorable as Theme from a Summer Place. With this song, however, we have fully immersed ourselves into the Kennedys' Camelot, and with it, the shining early years of the 1960s. As mentioned before, a lot of the American public wanted to hold on to the 50s with a white-knuckled grip in the early 1960s. But the beginning of the 1960s was pretty turbulent in terms of politics and our relationships with other countries in the early 1960s. At the time, Kennedy and his entire family sort of felt like a beacon of hope to a lot of American people. He was young, handsome, charismatic, and had a beautiful young family. He was the youngest president to be elected. To many Americans, Kennedy's Camelot felt like a symbol of America's youthful potential.
If everybody had an ocean across the USA, then everybody'd be served.
1963, Surfin' USA by the Beach Boys. I think it's safe to say by this point that everyone can tell that I'm a pretty big Beatles fan. Like many other Beatles fans, I sort of attach their arrival in my mind to the beginning of the 1960s and the beginning of the music craze of the 1960s. However, I think it's fair to point out the turning point that we see in music when the Beach Boys have their #1 song on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1963 with Surfing USA. Surfing USA isn't the best Beach Boys song, and it's actually a ripoff of a Chuck Berry song. But it's a complete vibe shift. From this point on, popular music in America felt different. However, with the death of Kennedy came a sudden shock to the nation. Americans desperately needed something to turn their hope towards after their young president was shot dead right before their eyes. And well, in come the Beatles. 1964, I Wanna Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. If 1963 feels like a turning point in American popular music, then 1964 was the tipping point. Kennedy dies in November of 1963, and then the Beatles arrive in the United States in February of 1964, and they were greeted instantly by screaming fans upon their arrival. 1963 is when we hear a shift in music taste in the American public. But 1964 is when we really start to see people really connecting to this music and sort of looking to this music for answers. No, the lyrics in I Wanna Hold Your Hand may not be as impactful and overwhelming as even some of the later Beatles songs that came out in the late 60s. But what people were looking to with this song was hope and love and happiness after feeling like a lot of things were ruined with the death of Kennedy. This is also the year that Sidney Poitier becomes the first black actor to win an Academy Award. This is the year when the Ford Mustang is revealed. At this point in 1964, rapid change is coming. In May of 1964, the first major student demonstrations against the Vietnam War take place in New York City and San Francisco.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
1965, Wooly Bully by Sam Sham and the Pharaohs. Wooly Bully is a song that was originally recorded in 1964 at none other than Sam Phillips' studio in Memphis, Tennessee. In fact, Wooly Bully was the first song recorded at this studio that received national attention and acclaim. No, it wasn't actually Elvis. The song is sort of famous for having unintelligible lyrics. In fact, a lot of DJs banned the song from their radio station because they had no idea what these guys were saying. The song is fun, short, and memorable. Most people, even if they're not really into 1960s music, would know this song. But this is also the same year that I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones sits at number 4 on the Billboard charts. This is also the same year that Bob Dylan goes electric at the Newport Folk Festival in Newport, Rhode Island. This is also the year that President Johnson would increase the number of troops going into Vietnam and would also increase the number of young men being drafted, all while also doubling down on his war on poverty. But music continues to hold a strong influence over the youth demographic in the mid-1960s.
All the leaves are brown.
1966, California Dreamin' by the Mamas and the Papas. If you were waiting for a moment on this list where you were thinking, now that is music from the 1960s, then this is that moment. Written by John and Michelle Phillips in 1963 while they were waiting out a particularly brutal winter in New York City and dreaming of the California heat. The song was originally recorded in 1965 and didn't find its popularity until the next year. This song might be the first obvious example as a #1 song of the year, where the song was obviously being influenced by youth culture as well as influencing the culture at the same time. In the mid-1960s, young people's faith in religion, literally, was sort of starting to fall apart. After all, in April of 1966 is when we get the famous Time magazine cover, Is God Dead? The lyrics in California Dreamin' and I Pretend to Pray really resonated with a lot of young people in the mid-1960s. It rattled off the tongues of millions of teens and young adults who felt like religion wasn't something that they really needed, especially as many people began to find religion to be quite restrictive and judgmental. More and more, young people were planning out their own futures instead of just following in the footsteps of their parents. 1967, To Sir with Love by Lulu. In 1967, the #1 song of the year was To Sir with Love by Scottish singer Lulu. A theme from the film of the same name, the song was a pop smash in the United States. The film came with this tagline, "A film as fresh as the girls in their minis." If that's not indicative of the times, I don't know what else would be.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and
1968, Hey Jude by the Beatles. 1968 was a difficult year in American history. It's the year we lost MLK and RFK. It was a summer of violent riots, the year of the Democratic National Convention, and the whole world is watching. Vietnam was raging more and more young men were coming home in body bags. Public trust in the government was more strained than ever. And it all just sort of seemed that the summer of love from 1967 hadn't really carried over into the next year. Although Paul McCartney wrote Hey Jude on more of a personal level, famously writing it partially for Julian Lennon after his parents' divorce, and partially writing it for himself as well as possibly John Lennon. It's possible that many listeners took the song to heart, using it as a crutch during such a volatile time in our country's history.
Sugar.
1969, Sugar Sugar by the Archies. In all honesty, I kind of expected this list to end with something a little bit more epic, I guess. than Sugar Sugar? Can we pretend that the number one song of 1969 was Aquarius / Let the Sun Shine In by the Fifth Dimension? I feel like that fits this video so much better. You're telling me that the 1960s ended with the best bubblegum pop song of all time? Well, maybe after all it was sort of deserved. After 1968, 1969 didn't really end up being the best year ever. In 1969, we have the Zodiac Killer, we have the Tate LaBianca murders, which effectively ended the hippie movement. Perhaps what our country really needed the most in 1969 was a dose of bubblegum pop. Now let's take a moment to compare and contrast music from the beginning of this decade to music from the end of this decade.
Inside, outside, Ventura County line. Inside, Santa Cruz and Inside, outside, Australia's Caribbean. Inside, outside, all over Manhattan. Hey Jude, don't be afraid. You were made to go out and...
Now, there was a definite lack of Jimi Hendrix on this list after I sort of built that up at the beginning of the video. But what was obvious from this list, at least to me, is that the culture of the 1960s was massively informed by what was happening in real life. This is the decade, of course, where artists would publicly be anti-war. There were so many protest songs that came out in the 1960s that the decade is kind of famous for it. This is also really the first time that the American public had to sort of leave their picturesque American lives behind to confront what was really happening in our country and what had been happening in our country. With televisions becoming much more accessible and the news having longer run times, it was very difficult to hide away from reality. Many artists of the 1960s felt that it was their personal responsibility to use their platform and use their talent for creating art to spread a message of peace and love. And I know it sounds corny to say peace and love today. We say peace and love so often that it sounds corny no matter what. But it did have meaning at a certain point. Music in the 1960s for many was the best possible way to vent out their frustrations, to call upon their fellow man, to document their drug experiences, to protest against an unjust war, and to make sense of a world that really at the time seemed to make no sense at all. Alright guys, well that's all for today. I really hope you enjoyed it. I really hope you enjoyed this series. It was a lot of fun to learn about what the number one song was for each year of the 1960s. I really wasn't expecting it to end on something like Sugar Sugar by the Archies, but the next year we had Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel, which I felt like maybe made a lot more sense. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a like, be sure to subscribe to Odd Quartet, and leave us a comment about what you thought about the musical evolution of the 1960s through whatever the number one Billboard Top Hot 100, whatever that was. And yeah, I really appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye-bye. Sorry. I was doing so well. No, I got an itch on my forehead and I got distracted. Not my Amazon Echo going off. Oh, I said it wrong. Lower back pain. I need lumbar support. Wow, I did it in one take.